fellow BookTube. My name is Nathan, and today I am talking about Jon Krakauer's 1997 nonfiction book, Into Thin Air, with the subtitle A Personal Account of the Mount Everest Disaster. So, this is in a way a companion video to what I did with The Abominable by Dan Simmons, which is a fiction book. So it's a historical fiction sort of, that has to do with an expedition to Mount Everest in the mid-1920s, but it's a fictional expedition that did not actually happen. So if you're interested in books about mountain climbing, then you can definitely go and check out my video on The Abominable by Dan Simmons. Now, in terms of the order that I did this in, I started with Into Thin Air, and it was kind of from there where I got to the end of this, and I was so excited by learning so much stuff about what it's like to climb Mount Everest that, to be perfectly honest, I had an idea of using Everest or one of the 8,000 meter mountains, one of the great mountains in the world, as a setting for a book that I would like to write. So I started investigating, only to find out that Dan Simmons wrote pretty much the book that I wanted to write. And so then I'm like, well, I've got to read this. And then I was pretty blown away by many aspects of that book. So that's kind of like my own little like reading history with what's been going on with this. So before I got into reading Into Thin Air, I was aware of it for a very long time, and I had just never quite gotten around to it, in part because, as I mentioned in the video that I did for Dan Simmons' The Abominable, I've never really been particularly interested in mountain climbing, alpinism in general, until fairly recently. And what really kind of changed it for me, what started was I saw the film Everest, and even though it is Hollywood blockbuster. It has to do with the disaster on Mount Everest in 1996. It's not an adaptation of Into Thin Air. As best I understand, it's more of an adaptation of Beck Weathers' book, who was one of the men who was on the mountain during the disaster, and so he's one of the figures in this book. So I watched that, and then I got into a whole bunch of the history of expeditions to Everest and mountain climbing in general, and then I'm like, well, I've got to go to probably the most commercial, the most commercially successful book about Mount Everest, and certainly the account that happened with 1996 and with many people dying on the mountain. So in general, what I would say is this is an absolutely fantastic book. It was a #1 New York Times bestseller, and it does absolutely make sense that so many people enjoyed the book. You can absolutely see why. There's lots and lots of interesting things that Jon Krakauer is doing in here. So just a short little bit about his own history. He was basically sent to Mount Everest as a journalist to cover the commercialization of the mountain, of the fact that you had a whole bunch of businesses, commercial enterprises that were really springing up in the early 1990s, getting into the mid-1990s, of offering people the opportunity to have guided expeditions up the mountain in a relatively safe way with fairly very well equipped teams that are going to lead you up the mountain and do a lot of the logistics for you, with arranging for permits and getting the tent set up and having equipment and food and getting the fixed lines, the ropes on the mountain, all of that, doing that for people, certainly for a considerable price, and then more and more people have been taking advantage of this. And certainly in the early to mid 1990s, you didn't see this until then, and this is what he was sent there to cover. So he was a journalist for, I think it was Outdoor or Outside, I think it's Outside magazine. And so he had written a bunch of articles about mountain climbing because he was, just in his own personal life, he really enjoyed rock climbing and mountain climbing, but he had never taken on something like Everest. He had never gone to the Himalayas. He had never actually climbed to really high altitude where you start dealing with altitude sickness. And so he basically got the opportunity to go there and document this, so he took advantage of it because this is an incredibly costly thing to do, and certainly even to this day, relatively few people have ever attempted Everest. It's a pretty exclusive thing to try to take on. Now, he certainly didn't expect going to Everest in 1996 that he was going to witness a disaster on the mountain. Like I say, it was supposed to be about the commercialization of the mountain itself, and it was not supposed to be about the dangers necessarily of it, but kind of questioning the ethics of exploiting the Tibetan people and Sherpas in general in order for wealthy Westerners to take advantage of their relative poverty and to get them to do the very difficult work on the mountain, the dangerous work on the mountain, in order for Westerners to have this adventure, right? But when they're not taking, the Westerners themselves are not taking the real risks. So that's not what ends up happening, though. That's not what he ends up writing about, because a number of people, I forget exactly how many, but it's somewhere around half a dozen or so people end up dying on the mountain for perplexing reasons. Essentially, a storm hit, and they were not prepared for this. They were right at the top of Everest, and so they were definitely above 8,000 meters, and basically they're in what's called the death zone, where the human body literally starts shutting down because of air pressure, and you basically cannot get oxygen into your body. Like, your lungs can't process it, and therefore every cell in your body is being deprived of oxygen, which means that your brain stops working appropriately. It's just not functioning at its full capacity, along with everything else, every organ on your body. So it's a pretty staggering thing for a journalist to try to document what's happening. And that's what is so fascinating to me about this book, is that there is a desperation in his writing, which is absolutely fascinating, because he is desperately trying to make sense of the tragedy. These people that he was climbing with personally, people that he was talking to get the news, like when you're, at Camp 4, tens of thousands of feet above sea level, and you find out that the guy that you were sharing a tent with, he's just gone, or he's dead. That he's trying to figure this out. How did this happen? What do you mean he's gone? What do you mean we can't find him? And the storm is just, bombarding them. And it takes everything for Krakauer himself to survive this. And then dealing with the guilt afterwards of the fact that he survived this, but expert guides did not. People who had significant more experience on the mountain, that they died in the tragedy. And he's trying to put the pieces together. Family members of the victims are trying to piece it together. And you can sense the frustration in his writing, where he is trying, as a journalist, as a nonfiction writer, to recount this as objectively as he can, but it's impossible. And he doesn't just try to be objective. He does bring his own subjectivity into the writing. And it's really fascinating from that standpoint. And the focus on memory, and the way one cannot perfectly rely on one's own memory, is really fascinating. He's got a really great quote in here from Harold Broadkey, from, I'm assuming this is either an essay or a short story, because it's got quotation marks around it rather than being italicized, called Manipulations. And the quotation goes like this: "I distrust summaries, any kind of gliding through time, any too great a claim that one is in control of what one recounts. I think someone who claims to understand but is obviously calm, someone who claims to write with emotion recollected in tranquility, is a fool and a liar. To understand is to tremble. To recollect is to re-enter and be riven. I admire the authority of being on one's knees in front of the event. And I think that you certainly get that. You certainly get that with Krakauer's writing, that he's not unmoved by this, and it is difficult for him to even understand. It's difficult, like you see that yearning for himself to try to understand it, like as if he can somehow make sense of the events, of the chronology, or all of the details, that will somehow decrease the tragedy, that he'll have some way to make sense of it all, but the inability to do so. And to try to find meaning in that, like, did people make mistakes? Did the guides make mistakes? What could have been done to prevent this? But ultimately, none of that matters, because this is a tragedy, and this is death, and they're not coming back. No matter how well he can recount the story, no matter how objective he can be, and you kind of get that sense of frustration within it. As a piece of nonfiction writing, it's spectacular. It's really, really spectacular. He originally wrote this as an essay for Outdoor or Outside magazine. Again, I can't remember the exact name of it, but he wrote it as a very long, I think it was 10,000 words or so is what he said for the essay length. And he knew that it wasn't enough. He wanted to go back to it. So then he expanded on this and then turned it into the book, into the nonfiction book that you get with Into Thin Air. And I've taken a graduate course when I was getting my master's degree on nonfiction literature. So treating essay writing and nonfiction writing as literary texts, to appreciate them in an artistic sense, to appreciate the work of journalists and biographers and essayists, to look at their work as being just as worthy of critical attention in terms of the actual prose itself. And it certainly holds up. I mean, we didn't study Into Thin Air as one of the texts for the course, but it reminds me of somebody who's a contemporary of Krakauer, although she's, I believe, still, a fair bit younger, but still writing at the same time. So Maggie Nelson, a lot of her work, certainly the red parts, when she really gets into the frustration of memory in trying to document horrible events, because in the red parts, and she's talking about the murder of her sister when she was a girl, and trying to go back and trying to figure out what exactly happened. This is really contrasted, I think, with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, because Capote was a journalist, and he's certainly talking about tragedy there, and it's nonfiction, but Capote called that a nonfiction novel. And that's not a mistake, because typically, like, a novel means it's fiction. But Capote, in writing In Cold Blood, then he believed that you can take actual events from the real world, but if one tells those events in a particular style, that it can read like a novel. And that's maybe putting it into that narrative sense can be perhaps a better way for a journalist to approach a subject like that, a story like that maybe through that narrative approach and getting the subjectivity of the victims, that one can somehow achieve something closer to objectivity, it's a fascinating text. But Capote's trying to be a lot more objective, and he's keeping himself out of the story. And I think, like, obviously it's because he wasn't part of it, even though he does end up later interviewing the murderers. But in this, then, Krakauer, of course, he is involved in the tragedy, and he's part of the story, and he brings his own subjectivity into the writing itself. It also reminds me of some of the writing. I'm not saying that it's exactly the same, and I don't want to get attacked for this, but some of the writing of Joan Didion as well, with Slouching Towards Bethlehem, and her interest in memory and the position that an essayist is in trying to recount events from the past, and what do you do with objectivity versus subjectivity. The only other thing that I really wanted to bring up with this is some of the structural elements of the book. So as much as he's treating it like nonfiction, he's also not treating it like nonfiction, which is interesting because at the beginning of the book, he is trying to be objective. He's trying to be comprehensive in showing everybody who is involved in this story. And so this is not me paraphrasing. It literally begins with Dramatis Personae, like the Latin term for the characters in this play, the characters who are in this drama. And these are real people. And then it goes on for several pages. So you've got, I haven't counted, but certainly around 100 or so, if not more, actual people who were there. And he's saying, like, this is their nationality, this is what country they're from, this is their role on the mountain, whether they were, you know, a climbing Sherpa, whether they were an expedition guide, whether they were part of like the IMAX crew, or whether they were a client who's paying to be there. It's an interesting thing. I know that he's been criticized for, certainly by the families of the victims, for in some ways not being objective and in other ways exploiting the tragedy. And I think that you can look at, I think some of that is fair and some of it is maybe unfair, but I think the strongest point of criticism would be that he does start with Dramatis Personae, like calling them, like as treating it like it's a play. And I think that that's a questionable phrase to put in there. I don't think having the list of people is wrong, but treating it like that, using that term that one would get at the beginning of a play, is very interesting. Let me say that. If you have thoughts on that, on any other reasons why he's doing that, I'd be very interested to hear other theories about this. The other thing, too, that he does from a structural element that I think is really great is that he begins each chapter with the elevation. And so wherever they're at, so, you know, being in Seattle, then it's, you know, like pretty close to sea level, and then being in Kathmandu, then it's quite a bit higher. And you actually get to, there's a very strong correlation, of course, between the elevation and the suspense within the book itself. And as they're getting higher and higher and higher, then the suspense does increase. And as they kind of decrease, then that's where you get the denouement of the book, that you have the falling action of it. And it's just a very interesting thing from a structural standpoint to do that, to say, here's the actual elevation, here's where we're at in terms of sea level, and see how well the actual events and the suspense within those events, how well that correlates to it. It's cueing the reader. It's saying, this is how dangerous it is at this point, because of course when you are above a certain level, then you are in the death zone, and so you know that every single minute that a human being is there is risking his or her life. So it's an incredible piece of nonfiction, and if you have even a passing interest in mountaineering and Mount Everest, then I think you would absolutely love the book if you have not already read it. If you have no interest in that, but you enjoy nonfiction, I think you're going to be pretty blown away by much of what he's doing. And if you haven't read a lot of nonfiction, and certainly narrative nonfiction, where it's storytelling, but it's nonfiction, I would say this would be a really, really good place to start. And so just in general, I think it's a fantastic, fantastic book, and it is well worth checking out. All right. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.